welcome back to EDH Deck Building. I am your host, Demo, and once again, you might have the wrong card in your commander deck if you have one of the cards or interactions that I am talking about in this video today. Just going over certain individual cards with individual commanders, but in general, just certain interactions, I guess rules interactions that sometimes won't work, which will apply to the cards that I'm talking about today, but also might apply to other commanders and other cards as well. So I'm going to start out this time with Killian Duelist, and there's a couple interactions here that I'm going to talk about with this commander. It's a pretty popular commander in the format, so if you guys are playing any of these cards in your deck and it might not be working the way you think, you might want to consider taking them out. Again, always with these interactions, there's a chance that even if you're not getting the interaction that I'm talking about specifically, you still might want to keep it in your deck, but I'm talking about interactions that specifically work with your commander that might not work the way you think they do. So, for example, Unburial Rites is one that was brought to my attention in the comments of another video. 4 and a black sorcery, return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield, and has flashback 3 and a white. So this is a card that could work in any deck, obviously. It's just getting creatures out of your graveyard, but doesn't work with your commander's ability. And I talked about this, I think, in the Zones video in my Magic Rules series, where I talked about cards being in different zones, taking on different properties. And I'm going to get to this more later in the video as well. So what Unburial Rites says is return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. So it does say target, which is what you want to be looking for with your Killian, of course, but it's targeting a creature card, not a creature, right? Those are two different things. If something is targeting a creature card, it's not going to be taking advantage of your commander's ability. So Unburial Rites is not going to be reduced by 2. So again, the card does work in the deck. It's not like it's a complete dud or anything. It's going to do what it normally would, but you're not going to be taking advantage of your commander's ability. Similarly, I see here on EDH Rec, a whole lot of Killian decks have single combat and Divine Reckoning in them. Very similar cards. Single combat, 3 white sorcery. Each player chooses a creature or planeswalker they control, then sacrifices the rest. Players can't cast creature or planeswalker spells until the end of your next turn. And Divine Reckoning is 2 white sorcery. Each player chooses a creature they control and you destroy the rest, and has flashback. So these cards are very similar in that you're getting to keep one creature and then you're destroying the rest. Now, these cards do work in the deck, I assume, if you're doing a Voltron strategy. I am just pointing out, again, I don't know if people think this or not, just that I see these cards are in a whole lot of Killian Duelist decks. So my thinking is that people are thinking these are reduced by 2 because you're choosing a creature you control. But of course, choosing is not the same as targeting. Neither of these cards say the word target on them, so they are not targeting. These probably do work in the deck if you want to do like a Voltron strategy with your Killian, because these are decent board wipes for a Voltron strategy, of course, because you're going to destroy all creatures but keep the one you want. But neither of these have their cost reduced by your commander's ability. I'm not sure if anyone actually out there is doing that, but if you are trying to do that, this doesn't work. All right, let's move on to a interaction that I've sort of covered before in past videos, but I'm going to talk specifically about Slicer Hired Muscle, one of these Autobot commanders that came out last year. I actually have a patron with this deck. Played against it recently. It's pretty interesting. 4 and a red, legendary artifact creature, robot 3/4, more than meets the eye, 2 and a red, double strike and haste. And at the beginning of each opponent's upkeep, you may have that player gain control of Slicer until end of turn. If you do, untap Slicer, goad it, and it can't be sacrificed this turn if you don't convert it. So I talked about this sort of interactions, or different sort of interactions, with Tangarth as well, which is a very similar commander that you're giving your opponent control of your commander. And you have to be very careful with the wording of the cards that you're going to be putting in that deck. Now, obviously, you're going to be wanting to put lots of equipment and aura and stuff like that on your commander. It's sort of, again, a Voltron style of strategy, but instead you're donating it to your opponents, right? The card that does not work, or probably isn't a super great fit, is the Reaver Cleaver, which I see is in 14% of Slicer decks on EDH Rec, and probably shouldn't be in any. I don't think it's a great fit, and I will explain why. So 2 and a red, legendary artifact equipment, equipped creature has +1/+1 and has trample, and whenever this creature deals combat damage to a player or planeswalker, create that many treasure tokens and equip 3. So of course, it's a great equipment, especially in a mono red deck where you probably want sort of a ramp option. The issue here is, whenever you see a card like this this, whether it be an equipment or an aura, we always see cards like that are imbuing these abilities on the creatures they're attached to. You have to look at those quotes. Those quotes are very important because when you see the quotes on a card, what that means is you are essentially printing those letters on the creature that is equipped with the Reaver Cleaver. So that means your Slicer is gonna have those words on it. Whenever this creature deals combat damage to a player or planeswalker, create that many treasure tokens. And whenever someone else controls that creature, that means, of course, they're getting that ability, right? If your opponent controls Slicer Hired Muscle because you've let them gain control of it, they control it, so all of the abilities printed on that commander, of course, are going to be controlled by them. So when they have Slicer under their control and they're attacking with it, when they connect, the Reaver Cleaver ability is going to apply to them and they're going to create all those treasure tokens. So maybe you want to be doing that. Again, this is not necessarily the wrong card, but if your Slicer is equipped with the Reaver Cleaver and your opponent is in control of it, they're going to create all that treasure tokens, and they're probably going to be creating a lot. Like, that doesn't seem like a fantastic game plan. What you could do is you could equip it onto your Slicer, attack with it on your turn like you normally would, get the treasure tokens, and then you would have to equip it to something else on your second main phase, so that if you're donating your Slicer, your opponent doesn't get the Reaver Cleaver ability as well. So again, I guess it kind of does work, but kind of doesn't. Might want to consider taking that one out of your Slicer deck. There's actually a pretty popular commander, over 1,800 decks on EDH Rec, and 14% of those decks have the Reaver Cleaver in there. It's probably not a great fit. All right, let's move on to a personal one for me, which is Kinzu of the Bleak Coven. I just personally made a deck with this one. I like it a lot. It's tons of fun. 4 and a black Phyrexian Vampire, 5/4 flying. When another non-token creature you control dies, you may pay 2 life and exile it. If you do, create a token that's a copy of that creature, except it's a 1/1 and has Toxic 1. And the wrong card that a whole lot of people are putting in this deck is Drivnod Carnage Dominus, which came out in the same set. And for that reason, I gave it some consideration myself, right? When I was putting my Kinzu deck together, I was like, hey, maybe that's a great fit. And I thought about it for a little bit, read over both cards, and I was like, nope, does not work. This interaction does not work with your commander. Again, might work with some of the creatures you have in the deck or something like that, but it doesn't actually work with what your commander is doing, and I will explain why. So Drivnod says if a creature dying causes a triggered ability of a permanent you control to trigger, that ability triggers an additional time. So I guess I should probably point out that if you're playing a Teysa Karlov deck, again, all the things I'm talking about here will apply as well, because she has essentially the exact same ability. And it seems like a great fit in a Kinzu deck because you, of course, are going to have lots of creatures dying all the time, and your commander wants creatures to be dying. But if we look at these two abilities, again, we got to read it carefully in order to make sure that it works in the deck. Whenever another non-token creature you control dies, you may pay 2 life and exile it. So that is a creature dying that is triggering an ability on a permanent we control, of course, which is what Drivnod wants. So of course, it will trigger an additional time. That actually does happen. However, the problem here is that it says, if you do, create a token that's a copy of that creature. So what's going to happen when you copy your Kinzu's ability is you're going to pay 2 life and exile that creature from your graveyard. And if you do, you create a token copy. So when the copy of the ability, when the ability triggers again, you're going to go to exile that card from your graveyard, but it's already been exiled, right? You can't exile that creature from your graveyard twice. When the ability resolves the first time, you've already exiled it. So when it goes to resolve the second time, it'll say, okay, well, now you got to pay 2 life and exile it. And if you do, you create a token copy. Well, you're not going to be exiling it because it's been exiled already. It's no longer in your graveyard. So you are no longer able to fulfill the if you do part of that ability, right? So you haven't exiled it from your graveyard, so you will not create the token copy. You don't get the double tokens here, if that's what you're trying to do in your Kinzu deck. Now, again, there's a lot of creatures dying. I mean, I have this deck, so I know lots of dies triggers and stuff like that. So Drivnod still might work in the deck, just doesn't work specifically with your commander. And again, while we're on the topic of Drivnod, let's talk about Ketheric Crucible Goliath, because I see that Drivnod is in a whole bunch of those decks as well. And I know it seems like maybe this is the case that it works, but it actually doesn't. And I've talked about this again in a past video, Negan, for example, is doing a very similar thing where it's a triggered ability off of sacrificing, not necessarily dying. Kethic is the same thing, right? At the beginning of your end step, you may sacrifice another creature. If you do, reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal a non-legendary creature card with lesser mana value and put it onto the battlefield and put the rest on the bottom of your library in random order. So nothing on this card is talking about dying at all. Drivnod is looking for creatures to die. And I know people will say, oh, well, when you sacrifice a creature, it is dying. Not necessarily, right? Those two things are not one and the same. If one of your opponents has a rest in peace in play, that creature will be sacrificed, but will not die, of course, because it won't hit the graveyard. In order for a creature to die, it has to go from the battlefield to the graveyard. If it's not actually hitting the graveyard, it's not actually dying. So yes, in most cases, when you sacrifice a creature, it is dying, but those two things are not the same. Drivnod will not work in your Kethic Crucible Goliath deck either, and it's on a whole bunch of those decks as well. Might want to consider taking it out. All right, let's move on to another interaction, but more gets into a bigger rules questions because, man, I get asked this one all the time. Specific interaction here, though, is Quintorius, Loremaster with Iroas, God of Victory. And I had this question asked about this specific interaction, but again, bigger rules question that I've been asked so many times. So Quintorius says at the beginning of your end step, exile target non-creature, non-land card from your graveyard. Create a 3/2 red and white spirit creature token. And of course, the question was, well, can I exile my Iroas from my graveyard? Because it is an legendary enchantment creature god, of course, but as long as your devotion to red and white is less than 7, Iroas isn't a creature. And I get this question all the time from people about these enchantment gods. Of course, there's a whole bunch of them. And when are they creatures? When are they not? Okay, the type on your card is always the type on your card in almost every single situation, right? Unless the card says otherwise. Your Iroas or your Erebos or your Karametra or any of those cards are legendary enchantment creature gods at all times, unless they're on the battlefield. The only thing that is making them not a creature is their actual ability. As long as your devotion, yada, 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 this isn't a creature, that ability, of course, only applies when the creature's on the battlefield. Just like all those other abilities only apply when it's on the battlefield, right? Certainly you can't be drawing cards with your Erebos when it's in your graveyard. So any of these legendary enchantment creature gods are going to be enchantments and creatures at all times. So in your library, in your hand, in your graveyard, they are both enchantments and creatures. If I cast my Erebos, someone can use a Swan Song to counter it because, of course, it is an enchantment spell while it is on the stack. They can also use an Essence Capture to counter my legendary enchantment creature because it says counter target creature spell, which while I'm casting it, it is a creature spell. The only thing that makes these enchantment creature gods not a creature is their own ability. So when they're on the battlefield and you don't have the appropriate devotion, they're not creatures. At any other time, they are creatures. So if we go back and look at Quintorius, right, what does it say? At the beginning of your end step, exile target non-creature, non-land card from your graveyard. So if Iroas is in your graveyard, it is going to be a legendary enchantment creature because that is the card type. So it is not non-creature. You cannot exile it from your graveyard with Quintorius's ability. So I hope that clarified things for some people. Again, talking about specific cards with specific commanders, but also just rules interactions in general, because a lot of the things I talk about in these videos, especially with dice triggers and equipping your commander and stuff like that, will apply to a lot of other commanders and a lot of other interactions as well. If you have any other interactions or wrong cards that people are putting in their decks, maybe ones you're not even sure about, maybe you're not sure and I can clarify in one of these videos, let me know in the comments below and I will cover it in the next one of these videos. That is it for today though, and thanks for tuning in.